Hi, this is Ted, and for the next hour, you'll be listening to a reading of articles and features from the Monday, January 5th New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. We'll start with this one. Trump's harshest Republican critics, lawmakers headed for the exits. It turns out that few things liberate Republicans to speak their minds about President Trump like the fact that they are departing Congress. By Kellen Browning. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia, once a fierce ally of President Trump, is set to depart Congress on Monday as a vocal critic of him and his administration. She used her final weekend in office to lament that Trump's military intervention in Venezuela was what many in MAGA thought they voted to end. She is far from the only Republican lawmaker to speak in markedly blunter terms about Trump just as they were leaving Congress or eyeing the exit. Lawmakers in both parties, of course, tend to be loath to undercut their leaders. It took a catastrophic debate for top Democrats to turn against former President Joseph Biden, and some prominent Republican skeptics of Trump, including Mitt Romney and Jeff Flake, were able to remain in office, at least for a little while. But Trump's grip on the Republican Party is so strong that for many of its lawmakers, even mild criticism frequently goes hand in hand with a retirement announcement. Here's a look at some of the other Republican members of Congress who have broken ranks with the president on the way out. Senator Bob Corker. During Trump's first term, Senator Bob Corker of Tennessee broke with him over the white nationalist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017, when the president said that there were, quote, very fine people on both sides. Mr. Corker told reporters that the president has not yet been able to demonstrate the stability nor some of the competence that he needs to demonstrate in order to be successful. Trump responded by attacking Mr. Corker on Twitter, and the senator announced the next month that he would not run for re-election. Representative Susan Brooks, criticizing racially offensive remarks. Representative Susan Brooks of Indiana, who was leading House Republican recruitment efforts for the 2020 election as the party worked to regain the majority, surprised her colleagues by announcing in June 2019 that she would not run for re-election. The next month, she was one of 4 Republicans who voted with Democrats on a resolution to condemn Trump's social media posts, telling 4 Democratic congresswomen of color to, quote, go back to the countries they came from. In fact, 3 of the 4 were born in the U.S. I voted to condemn the racially offensive remarks the leader of our country made, Ms. Brooks wrote on Twitter at the time. Representative Ryan Costello. Representative Ryan Costello of Pennsylvania announced in March 2018 that he would not run for re-election after a court-ordered redraw of a congressional map made his seat much more difficult to defend. But he was quick to cite Trump's style as a reason he felt compelled to leave. Quote, whether it's Stormy Daniels or passing an omnibus spending bill that the president threatens to veto after promising to sign, it's very difficult to move forward in a constructive way today, he told a local newspaper. He was unfiltered later that year, too, suggesting that Trump's mocking of Republicans who lost their re-election bids was like dancing on somebody's grave and was deeply offensive. Representative Dave Reichert. During his time in Congress, Representative Dave Reichert of Washington, a moderate Republican, was not a particular fan of Trump. However, it was not until Mr. Reichert announced his retirement in September 2017 that he unleashed a more scathing criticism. In an interview with Vice days later, he mentioned Trump's Access Hollywood comments about groping women and said he would have felt compelled to take action if Trump had made them in Seattle when Reichert was the sheriff. If the statute of limitations was still in existence and he made those comments in King County, and you know it happened in King County, that's a person I would have to arrest. Representative David Trott. Representative David Trott of Michigan cited Trump as a factor in his decision to announce his retirement in September 2017. That November, speaking more freely without the constraints of a re-election campaign, Mr. Trott told CNBC, "We have different styles, and I sometimes don't understand some of the things he does and says." He added, "It's a very partisan environment, and I think that problem has been exacerbated under Trump." Representative Charles Dent. Representative Charles Dent of Pennsylvania was a moderate Republican who clashed with Trump, especially over his efforts to repeal the Affordable Care Act. After conservative activists threatened to support a primary challenge against Mr. Dent, he announced in September 2017 that he would retire. The next April, Mr. Dent introduced a bill aiming to protect the special counsel Robert Mueller from any attempts by Trump to remove him as he investigated Russian interference in the 2016 election. Days later, Mr. Dent said he would resign early and leave his seat in a matter of weeks rather than serve out his term. The spontaneity and lack of impulse control are areas of concern for lots of members on both sides of the aisle, said Mr. Dent of Trump that month. Disorder, chaos, instability, uncertainty, intemperate statements are not conservative virtues, in my opinion. Here's an interesting article. Diamond's $770 million windfall shows how banking is great again. This is by Bob Copeland. For nearly 15 years, Jamie Dimon, the bank chieftain, has carried around what might as well be a talisman when he sees regulators, elected officials, and journalists. At just the right time in meetings, he breaks out a single-page printout that he calls a spaghetti chart. On it, Mr. Dimon's underlings have crammed in tiny type a comically complicated flow chart meant to represent the various laws and regulations to which his company, J.P. Morgan Chase, is subject. The theatrics have finally worked. The Trump administration is not just taking apart regulations, but attacking whole regulatory agencies that date back to the 2008-2009 financial crisis and were meant to keep banks from giving in to their worst impulses. Regulators have also made it easier for banks to peddle in risky assets again, like cryptocurrency, and Trump paused enforcement of foreign anti-bribery rules. The deregulatory bonanza alone makes it the best time in a generation to be a banker. But there's more. Falling interest rates and a permissive set of antitrust overseers are helping reverse a lull in the lucrative business of arranging mergers and acquisitions, as the $100 billion bidding war between Netflix and Paramount for Warner Brothers Discovery shows. Once imperiled real estate loans look steadier thanks to the rebound of in-office work. Stocks are near record levels. The bond market had its best year since 2020, and gold and silver have soared, all of which feeds the trading businesses that keep Wall Street's profit machine humming. In other words, as analysts at Keefe, Bruyette, and Woods recently put it, there is something for everyone. Big bank stocks rose 29% in 2025, almost doubling the gain of the U.S. market overall. Smaller lenders and community banks, which tend to have a narrower focus on areas such as residential mortgages and consumer checking accounts, also gained, but performed considerably less well. For Mr. Dimon and his counterparts, this means paydays closer to the scale of hedge fund managers or Silicon Valley startup founders than the caretakers of old line lenders. A combination of salary, bonuses, dividends, stock grants, and appreciations in his allotment of the bank's shares yielded roughly $770 million in 2025 for J.P. Morgan's chief executive, according to the company's disclosures. The bank's stock rose 34% last year. For the chief executive of Citi, whose shares rose more than 65% in 2025 after the bank slashed tens of thousands of jobs in a years-long restructuring, and Goldman Sachs, shares up 53%, the paydays were more than $100 million each. The chief executive at Capital One, shares up 36%, Richard Fairbank, made more than $300 million, including proceeds from stock he sold during the year. His compensation included a $30 million bonus after the Trump administration waved through the lender's acquisition of Discover Financial. For all the executives, the totals include some amount of gains from stock that they haven't yet sold and that they will have to remain in their jobs to fully collect. Most of Diamond's haul, for example, came from a combination of dividends and appreciation on the company stock he owns. For Goldman's chief, David Solomon, and Citi's Jane Fraser, last year's earnings were more evenly split between salary and bonuses and appreciation in shares they already owned. A spokesman for J.P. Morgan said a portion of Mr. Diamond's gains could be traced to shares that he bought voluntarily as far back as 2 decades ago, as opposed to his regular awards from the bank's board, which he leads. Representatives for Citi, Goldman, and Capital One declined to comment. It's not yet clear what the hundreds of thousands of lower-level employees will earn in total, as banks typically give out annual bonuses in January. Johnson Associates, a pay consultancy, expects that tally to be higher than it was last year, with bumps ranging from 5% to 25%, depending on the exact role. This has been brewing for a long time, said Glenn Shore, a longtime bank analyst at Evercore. He compared the atmosphere to the optimistic years 2 decades ago, before the housing crash and the economic spike in 2021, when COVID-19 pandemic lockdowns eased. To Mr. Shore, this period feels sustainable and unbubble-like, in part because of near-bottomless demand for banks to finance booming sectors such as artificial intelligence and related data centers. That's hardly certain in the face of mounting worry that the AI hype might be overheating. Wall Street's biggest names in private equity and private credit, which borrow heavily from the major banks, have invested hundreds of billions in the AI rollout. If reality doesn't match the big dream for the nascent technology, banks and other asset managers will wind up paying dearly for it. Bankers, like real estate agents, will almost always tell you it's a great time to do a deal. This time around, however, they have also been peppering their public remarks with unease about the economy, particularly for low-income Americans, and high-profile bankruptcies of companies that were earlier assumed to be solid. Though banking may appear to be the very stereotype of a high-flying career, it has been slipping in prominence and prestige for decades. Enthusiasm for the profession and money began to shift towards Silicon Valley in the first internet frenzy, and the industry took a further hit for helping propagate debacles such as the Enron fraud. Less than 10 years later, they were public enemy number one for their roles in financing the subprime mortgage implosion. Since 2009, politicians of both parties have pushed regulations like the Dodd-Frank Act to discourage banks from making profit-seeking punts with money from deposits. That made banking both less lucrative and less exciting, and new college and business school graduates interested in finance began to treat the industry as a pit stop preceding more remunerative careers elsewhere. The financial world's most recent superstars are lenders who brand themselves as private credit. In the more mundane world of regional and community banking, roughly 1,000 of the 5,300 banks that existed in 2015 have closed. 7 were started in 2025. Now, however, Trump's appointees are making it less onerous than ever to operate a bank. They have all but killed a long-running effort by international regulators to require large banks to hold more cash-like reserves to protect against bank runs and unexpected losses. 2 days before Christmas, a key U.S. bank regulator proposed lifting by 14 times the asset threshold for a bank to receive extra oversight, essentially exempting all but a handful of lenders from the maximum security. Newcomers are applying to become banks, including PayPal, which previously said explicitly that it did not want to be one, and Erebor, a startup backed by 2 prominent boosters of Trump, Palmer Luckey and Joe Lonsdale. But it's not just Trump's associates who are scoring fortunes. Mr. Solomon has pointedly avoided weighing in on politics, and Mr. Diamond privately supported Kamala Harris in the 2024 presidential race. The J.P. Morgan spokesman said his boss wasn't resting either. Mr. Diamond continues to show off the spreadsheet of J.P. Morgan's regulators, arguing that even more should be done. And you're listening to a reading of articles and features on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Here's a good one for the beginning of the year, for those of us who have made New Year's resolutions. Our former restaurant critic changed his eating habits. You can too, by Pete Wells. Amazon lists more than 70,000 diet books. Not a single one is called Eat Like a Restaurant Critic. That line of work, which was mine from 2012 until 2024, gave me many rewards, but an easy glide path to health was not one of them. By my last year on the job, I was a mess. I creaked and groaned and belched like a tractor. Heaving myself out of the backseat of a car took so much effort that I dreamed about a portable winch. I waddled to the bathroom 4 or 5 times a night between bouts of heartburn. I woke up with headaches, a mouth as dry as an emery board, and a heavy coating of fatigue that I could never shake. With each new complaint, I thought, so this is life after 60. I continued to believe this until a doctor sent me a series of numbers preceded by the words blood pressure, weight, body mass index, triglycerides, blood sugar. The numbers were large, he said. Taken together with my physical complaints, they pointed to prediabetes, fatty liver disease, metabolic syndrome, sleep apnea, acid reflux, and obesity. The prospect of diabetes scared me the most. Above all, it's what drove me to ask for another job at the Times and to teach myself how to eat again. Almost 2 years later, with no medication except a daily blood pressure pill, almost all of those conditions have receded to less scary levels, although the cholesterol in my blood is putting up a fight. Today, I'm about 55 pounds lighter than I was at my zenith, a loss roughly equivalent to dropping an entire male basset hound. Interesting. Slimming down was not my main purpose. I never counted a single calorie. Somehow that took care of itself because of the new ways I started shopping, cooking, and eating back then, and have more or less stuck to since. Although the way I used to feed myself was unconventional, the results of my years-long binge are all too typical. More than 2 out of 5 people in the United States have obesity. A third are pre-diabetic. 1 in 10 has type 2 diabetes itself. Genes and other factors can play a role in these conditions, but the root problem for millions of us is that we have stopped eating sensibly. We stuff our stomachs with far more food than we need. No wonder about 12% of American adults say they have tried one of the GLP-1 medications for weight loss. I'm no expert on nutrition. On the subject of overeating, though, my credentials are hard to beat. In my long climb out of the deep pit I dug myself into, I've come to understand a few things about how I got there. As I've tried to build a healthier relationship with food, I've also learned a bit about the ways our bodies and minds work. Each Monday for the next 4 weeks, I'll lay out some of the insights that helped me and some recipes that reflect how I eat at home these days. By describing how I learned to eat a more balanced diet, I do not mean to suggest that you will have the same luck with my routine or that you should even try. I needed to control sugar, cholesterol, and overeating in general. I didn't worry, though, about sodium and potassium, which would be major concerns for someone with kidney disease. Obviously, anyone with a specific health issue should get advice from a doctor. My assumption is that, like me, a lot of people simply want to eat less of the stuff we know we're supposed to avoid and more of the stuff that's better for us. These are not nutritional guidelines, but general principles on how to behave more sensibly in the presence of food. The behavioral approach has become a dominant school of thought in mainstream nutrition, as it's become clear that the mindset that reduces the challenges of dieting to mere math, otherwise known as calories in, calories out, gets most people nowhere. Eating is, after all, a behavior. We learn how to do it, and we can unlearn our habits if there turns out to be a better way. Breaking up with sugar. The first thing I set out to do when I left the doctor's office was to hunt for simple carbohydrates to cut out of the meals I ate at home. At the time, all I cared about was reversing my slow slide into diabetic territory. What I didn't know was that the sugar in simple carbohydrates had been driving my need to keep eating, and that reducing my intake would help reset my appetite. Even I was surprised by how many simple carbs I was eating. There were English muffins with plum jam that I made myself. The teaspoons of sugar, which towered higher and higher as time went on, in each of the 4 cups of coffee after waking up. Brown sugar in oatmeal, wildflower honey on buttered toast, Vermont maple syrup on waffles, orange, pineapple, grapefruit juice, croissant, cardamom buns, blueberry muffins, cider donuts, cumulus heaps of white rice at lunch, hunk after hunk of bread with dinner, cookies to stave off the afternoon naps, which usually came anyway. That's just a partial list. 5 months into my sugar reset, I got an email from my doctor containing a lovely lyrical phrase: "You are no longer pre-diabetic." By then, I had lost more than 20 pounds too, but resetting my simple carbohydrate baseline had ripple effects throughout my life. The less sugar I ate, the easier it was to eat less of everything. I was no longer strapped into what nutritionists call the glucose roller coaster, the cycle of sugar highs and deep lows that can lead to insulin resistance, wrecking the body's ability to regulate hunger. In the US and increasingly around the world, supermarkets and chain restaurants are packed with roller coaster foods that promise ever more intense flavors and pleasures, but only leave us wanting more. We're supposed to feel satiated and full, and we don't, said Ashley Gearhart, a psychologist at the University of Michigan who studies compulsive eating. We're being tricked. As I ate less added sugar and replaced refined grains with whole ones, my appetite shrank and my howling desires for sweet stuff became quieter and easier to ignore. I had more energy and seemed to think clearly again for the first time in years. I had unleashed forces that would make it easier to put in place all the other changes I'll cover in the next few weeks. Basically, you were eating less of foods that encouraged you to overeat and more of foods that don't do that, said Marion Nestle, an emerita professor of food, nutrition, and public health at New York University. Pretty much what any sensible nutritionist would advise. Shift out of overdrive. Nutritionists say that a great many people eat more added sugar than they should. A starting point is to figure out whether you're getting more than 10% of your total calories from added sugar, which should be the maximum intake, according to the federal government's dietary guidelines for Americans. Unlike protein, fat, and vitamins, added sugar isn't necessary to our bodies, so there's no recommended minimum amount, just a maximum. For the past 5 years, nutrition labels on packaged foods have been required to list the amount of added sugars. They can travel around under many aliases, including some that sound harmless and maybe even wholesome: evaporated cane juice, agave nectar, fruit juice concentrate, and brown rice syrup. For me and for many people, there's little reason to worry about the sugars naturally found in fruits and vegetables, where they are packaged with other things that help you feel full sooner and slow down the absorption of glucose into the blood. Sweet potatoes are called sweet potatoes for a reason, but I don't think twice about eating one for dinner because they're fairly gentle on the blood sugar, especially when boiled and served in their skins. I love them that way. I might as well admit that chief among the other things that help you feel full are what nutritionists insist on calling fiber, a word so off-putting that it makes me want to seek solace in the arms of the nearest cinnamon bun. Luckily, when it comes to simple carbs like rice and flour, we can use the less lumpish phrase whole grains to describe the same general idea. And this is what to look for if you find you eat too much white rice and white bread. Whole grains happen to have more flavor, too. This is the heart of my first reset: eating carbohydrates in their original, sturdy, crunchy, complicated forms. I knew it would be better for me, and having raised 2 boys, I probably should have known that going through sugar overdrive many times a day was not producing the most rational behavior. As my body adjusted, I stopped acting like a toddler at a birthday party. My whole diet, everything I ate, started to take a new shape. And it just ends there, and I assume that that means it'll be continued next Monday. And after that interlude, here's another disturbing article. Supreme Court increasingly favors the rich, economists say, by Adam Liptak. Supreme Court justices take two oaths. The first, required of all federal officials, is a promise to support the Constitution. The second, a judicial oath, is more specific. It requires them, among other things, to do equal right to the poor and to the rich. A new study being released on Monday from economists at Yale and Columbia contends that the Supreme Court has in recent decades fallen short of that vow. The study, called Ruling for the Rich, concludes that the wealthy have the wind at their backs before the justices, and that a good way to guess the outcome of a case is to follow the money. The study adds to what Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, in a dissent in June, called the unfortunate perception that moneyed interests enjoy an easier road to relief in this court than ordinary citizens. The study found that the Supreme Court has become deeply polarized in cases pitting the rich against the poor, with Republican appointees far more likely than Democratic ones to side with the wealthy. That is starkly different from the middle of the last century, when appointees of the two parties were statistically indistinguishable on this measure. The general critique is not new, and it may figure in the drop in public confidence in the court in recent years, as opinion polls show. In a 2021 book, Supreme Inequality, Adam Cohen, an author and former member of the New York Times editorial board, argued that the court's decisions have lifted up those who are already high and brought down those who are already low. In an interview, Mr. Cohen said that the new study from The Economists covered ground that some of us have been observing for a long time. He pointed to Supreme Court decisions amplifying the role of money in politics, weakening public sector labor unions, and curtailing federal regulators. But it's great to see, he added, respected academics crunching the numbers and producing the data to show that this is exactly what has been going on. Law professors and political scientists have studied a related question, examining the rate at which businesses prevailed in various Supreme Court eras. They used a straightforward methodology, one that first identified cases with a business on one but not both sides, and then examined how the court ruled. The adversary might be an employee, a job applicant, a shareholder, a union environmental group, or a government agency. One such study, conducted by Lee Epstein of Washington University in St. Louis and Mitu Gulati of the University of Virginia, concluded that over the century ending in 2021, the court ruled for businesses an average of 41% of the time. But the court, led by Chief Justice John Roberts since 2005, decided for businesses 63% of that time. In contrast, businesses prevailed just 29% of the time before the liberal court led by Chief Justice Earl Warren from 1953 to 1969, that study found. The new study, conducted by Fiona Scott Morton of Yale and Andrea Pratt and Jacob Spitz, both of Columbia, relied on a more ambitious methodology, one that categorized the parties as rich or poor according to their likelihood of being wealthy, and a justice's vote is favoring the rich if its outcome would directly shift resources to the party that is more likely to be wealthy. By way of example, they said, the court's 2007 decision in Massachusetts versus the Environmental Protection Agency, which required the agency to regulate emissions of greenhouse gases if it found that they endangered public health, favored the poor because it shifts resources away from shareholders who are on average wealthier than average citizens. There is, the study's authors conceded, a subjective component to such judgments, but they developed what they said was a transparent and replicable protocol, coding decisions as favoring the rich if, for instance, they ruled for employers against workers, for companies against customers, for businesses against the government, to reduce competition, or to weaken the social safety net. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Yale undergraduates used that protocol to code decisions involving economic issues from 1953 on. Cases that were unanimous or hard to categorize were discarded, and quality checks were used to try to ensure consistency. We focused our efforts on cases where an intelligent person could work out which way the money is moving, said Professor Scott Morton. The study showed a growing partisan divide between the justices. In 1953, the study's authors wrote, Democratic and Republican appointees are statistically indistinguishable, deciding on average about 45% of the cases in favor of the rich. By 2022, they wrote, that share is about 70% for the average Republican justice and 35% for the average Democratic justice. Put another way, they added, the Republican appointees have become more pro-rich at roughly twice the rate that Democratic appointees have become more pro-poor. Legal scholars had mixed reactions to the Economist's study. Professor Gulati was initially wary. At first I got the heebie-jeebies at their coding, he said. Undergraduates reading cases and deciding, that's a tough judgment call for even an experienced lawyer or judge. But he added that it might be time to embrace new methods that give us fresh perspectives. Jonathan Adler, a law professor at William & Mary, was not impressed. The study included some indefensible assumptions, he said, like one that all regulation, including environmental regulation, is pro-poor. In the end, he said, it appears to show nothing more than that Republican appointees are more conservative than that they used to be. At his confirmation hearings in 2005, Chief Justice Roberts mused about whether he would stand up for the powerless. Somebody asked me, are you going to be on the side of the little guy, he said? And you obviously want to give an immediate answer, but as you reflect on it, if the Constitution says that the little guy should win, the little guy is going to win in court before me. But if the Constitution says that the big guy should win, well, then the big guy is going to win, because my obligation is to the Constitution. That's the oath. This isn't an article, but you might be interested in knowing that after that article on nutrition, there's also here an article about how to make Dubai chocolate cake, which looks really good and really unhealthy. And now for some opinion pieces. Here's David French. He was off last week, but he's back. Trump is unleashing forces beyond his control. War, the Prussian military thinker Karl von Clausewitz wrote, is a mere continuation of policy by other means. If there is one line that virtually every army officer learns from Clausewitz's posthumously published 1832 book on war, it's that description of the purpose of armed conflict. Those words were among the first that popped into my head when I woke up Saturday morning to the news that the American military had attacked Venezuela, seized its dictator, Nicolas Maduro, and brought him to the United States to face criminal charges. The reason those words occurred to me was simple. The attack on Venezuela harks back to a different time, before the 19th century world order unraveled, before two catastrophic world wars, and before the creation of international legal and diplomatic structures designed to stop nations from doing exactly what the United States just did. One of the most important questions any nation must decide is when and how to wage war. It's a mistake, incidentally, to view Clausewitz as an amoral warmonger. He wasn't inventing the notion he describes. He was describing the world as it was. His statement is a pithy explanation of how sovereign states have viewed warfare for much of human history. When a strong state operates under the principle that war is just another extension of policy, it is tempted to operate a bit like a mob boss. Every interaction with a weaker nation is tinged in some way with the threat of force. Nice little country you have there. Shame if something happened to it. This is not fanciful. In a telephone conversation with The Atlantic's Michael Scherer, Trump threatened Venezuela's new leader, Delcy Rodriguez, who served as Maduro's vice president. If she doesn't do what's right, Trump said, she's going to pay a very big price, probably bigger than Maduro. Diplomacy and economic pressure are almost always still a first resort for powerful nations. But if they fail to achieve the intended results, well, you can watch footage from the American strike in Venezuela to know what can happen next. But the Clausewitzian view isn't the only option for nations and their leaders. There's a better model for international affairs, one that acknowledges the existence of evil and the reality of national interests, but also draws lines designed to preserve peace and human life. Karl von Clausewitz, meet Thomas Aquinas. In the Summa Theologica, written in the 13th century, Aquinas outlined three cardinal requirements of what came to be known as just war theory. First, war must be waged through the lawful operation of a sovereign and not through the private adventurism of ambitious individuals. Second, the war must be based on a just cause. National self-defense or collective self-defense are obviously just, for example. Third, there must be a just purpose, namely the advancement of good and the avoidance of evil. One way to think about the shifting patterns of warfare is that humanity seesaws between Clausewitz and Aquinas. Strong nations impose their will on the weak and then, eventually, try to impose their will on one another. When catastrophe results, as it invariably does, they turn back to Aquinas. You can actually see the results of this shifting approach across the sweep of history. An analysis of global deaths in conflict shows that war is always with us, but its intensity waxes and wanes. Periods of extreme suffering and death are followed by periods of relative quiet, followed again by an age of horror. Consider history since World War I. After the ongoing slaughter of trench warfare, the world attempted to ban aggressive warfare and to establish an international institution, the League of Nations, to keep peace. The League failed, in part because the United States refused to join, and after an even more horrible world war, the world again tried, this time under American leadership. Echoes of Aquinas are all over the UN Charter. Article 2 of the UN Charter bans aggressive warfare, taking away a key tool in the Clausewitz toolbox. Article 51 permits individual and collective self-defense to keep greater powers in check, and Chapter 5 established a body, the Security Council, that's designed to keep the peace. No one would argue that the system is perfect. We've seen wars of aggression since World War II, but the system has achieved its primary goal. The world has been spared total war. The Aquinas model, however, has to fight two foes, the will to power and the loss of memory. Just war theory demands restraint from the powerful. It asks great powers to forego imposing their will, even to the point of subordinating their short-term national interests to the long-term aspiration of international peace and justice. That's where our loss of memory comes into play. Restraint is more persuasive when people remember a world war, and the people who build the UN and NATO had been through too. In that sense, the moral argument against aggressive war has practical application. The world has seen what happens when the will to power dominates world affairs, and its leaders know, or should know, that the most catastrophic conflicts can start from the most modest beginnings. When Gavrilo Princip took aim at the Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in 1914, for example, and Austria-Hungary mobilized against tiny Serbia, how many world leaders grasped that more than 16 million people would die in the war to come? When memory fades, the Clausewitz model grows more tempting, in part because it can achieve quick results, just as it did in Venezuela early Saturday. Not even the angriest opponents of Trump's intervention in Venezuela should whitewash the rule of Maduro. He was a corrupt and violent dictator who impoverished and oppressed his people. The economic numbers tell one version of that story. In 2012, the year before Maduro took power, the gross domestic product of Venezuela was more than $372 billion. In 2024, it was just under $120 billion, a terrible collapse. He retained power only by defying democracy. In 2024, election observers believe he lost his bid for a third term by a more than 30-point margin. His opponent, Edmundo Gonzalez, won more than 65% of the vote, and Maduro won just over 30%. The official tallies, however, gave Maduro the victory. But talking about GDP numbers and vote totals seems inadequate when addressing the pure human misery caused by the Maduro regime. Since 2014, almost 8 million Venezuelans have fled the country to escape poverty, corruption, and oppression. This is more than a quarter of Venezuela's population before Maduro was president. Even so, the ends do not justify the means. The Trump administration, acting entirely on its own and without seeking a congressional approval, decided it was in the best interests of the United States to remove Maduro from power. But when it struck, it violated every principle of just war. First, Trump acted unilaterally, turning his back on the sovereign constitutional requirements of American law. He did not consult with Congress. He did not secure a declaration of war. He simply attacked a sovereign country on his authority alone. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, has argued that the administration's action wasn't an act of war, but rather a law enforcement operation, and that the Defense Department merely protected the arresting officers. This defense is laughable. Under that reasoning, a president could transform virtually any war into a law enforcement operation by indicting opposing leaders and claiming that the large military forces needed to secure the leader's arrest were simply protecting law enforcement. That's not an argument, it's an excuse. Second, Trump struck without a casus belli, a cause of war, without just cause recognized by international law and the UN Charter. As Jack Goldsmith, a law professor at Harvard and a former assistant attorney general for the Office of Legal Counsel under President George W. Bush, argued in a post on Substack, the attack pretty clearly violates the Charter, even if there's no clear way to enforce the Charter's commands. Third, while removing a dictator from power can be a just end, Trump's decision to turn his back on the democratically elected opposition is profoundly troubling. That the remaining elements of a corrupt regime still govern the country, subject to American demands to negotiate oil deals with American companies, risks perpetuating corruption and oppression at the expense of freedom and democracy. Nothing here is new. In a sharp article for the Free Press, the historian Neil Ferguson argued that Trump's attack on Venezuela was a piece of a much larger whole, the restoration of the politics and diplomacy of 1900, the years before the catastrophe of World War I. The gunboat diplomacy of the Gilded Age certainly meant that the U.S. dominated Central and South America. It imposed a quasi-colonial reality on the region. Each nation developed under at least some degree of American oversight. Every nation was only as sovereign as the U.S. allowed it to be. Trump's attack on Venezuela didn't take place in a vacuum either. In December, the administration released its national security strategy paper that put the Western Hemisphere first. The document addressed the Americas before it addressed Asia, Europe, and the Middle East, and it declared that the United States will reassert and enforce the Monroe Doctrine to restore American preeminence in the Western Hemisphere. The president already has a name for his revival of 19th century American foreign policy, the Monroe Doctrine. At the same time, the paper created a dangerous distance between the U.S. and its European allies. It declared that Europe must stand on its own feet and operate as a group of aligned, sovereign nations, including by taking primary responsibility for its own defense. In isolation, that statement isn't terribly problematic. The nations of Europe are rich enough and strong enough to shoulder most of the burden of collective defense. American allies, though, contribute more than many Americans may think. According to a recent RAND study, America contributed roughly 39% of the total defense burden by 2023, a number that has dropped substantially since the end of the Cold War. Trump has embraced the Monroe Doctrine enthusiastically. He's engaged in economic warfare against Canada and Mexico. He said that Canada should be America's 51st state. He has designs on Greenland, part of the sovereign territory of Denmark, a NATO ally. This brings us back to the fatal flaw of running the world through spheres of influence and the amoral approach to war as an extension of policy. Smaller nations don't want to be dominated by the strong, and strong nations don't want to see their rivals get stronger, so they make alliances. In 1914, Serbia had Russia and Belgium had Britain. In 1939, Poland had France and Britain. That's exactly how regional conflict turned into global war. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. If Americans wonder why any South American nation would seek closer ties with other foreign powers, perhaps we should ask what their history has been with the U.S. and what the people of South America think about an aggressive revival of the Monroe Doctrine. There are better and worse ways to argue about Trump's approach. The worst argument is to say that Trump set a precedent with his intervention in Venezuela, a precedent that nations such as Russia, China, and Iran will be eager to follow in their own spheres of influence, and we will have no standing to object when our adversaries take the same approach to countries in their spheres of influence that we took in ours. But Vladimir Putin's Russia, Xi Jinping's China, and revolutionary Iran have never had the slightest concern for just war theory or any moral argument. They're held in check, to the extent that they are, by deterrence or, when deterrence fails, raw military force. The better argument recognizes that there will never be a unanimous embrace of just war theory. It recognizes that the UN Charter is doomed to often be more aspirational than operational. This argument recognizes that the world order doesn't depend on every great power for its existence, but it does depend on the greatest power, the United States. Put another way, our national commitment to Aquinas keeps Clausewitz at bay. We can barely keep the world order together when only 3 of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, the US, Britain, and France, comply with the UN Charter and international law. But if the United States joins Russia and China in their approach to armed conflict and international relations, then the Western post-war consensus is truly dead. America First isn't necessarily isolationist. There's nothing isolationist about arresting the leader of a sovereign nation and pledging to run it, but it is myopic. It pursues the sugar high of national power at the expense of justice and peace. You can see that Trump is on that sugar high right now. On Sunday night, NBC's Sahil Kapoor reported that Trump was still saying, "We're going to run Venezuela. If they don't behave," he added, "we'll do a second strike." But Trump was thinking about not just Venezuela. Colombia is very sick too, he said. Cuba is ready to fall. He also threatened to strike Iran if it kills protesters and brought up Greenland again. We need Greenland from the standpoint of national security, he said. If there is anything that could decisively wreck NATO, it would be an attempt to annex Greenland. Annexation could conceivably empower Denmark to invoke Article 5, the collective self-defense provision of the North Atlantic Treaty, against the United States. But there's a further problem. The true international norm is that when the strong dominate the weak try to become strong. That can mean alliances with enemies. That can mean global rearmament. That can mean nuclear proliferation. It can also mean that a foolish world once again endures the high cost of forgetting what it's like when great powers go to war. And we'll end with something a little more positive. This is A Case for Beauty in a Fleeting World by Margaret Renkl. "I can't believe you haven't read this," my husband said one day right before Thanksgiving. He was holding Maggie O'Farrell's 2020 novel, Hamnet. "This book has your name all over it." Haywood wasn't the first person to tell me I'd love Hamnet, but I found myself avoiding it when it first came out. A book subtitled A Novel of the Plague was not what I wanted to read in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, and I never got back to it later on. That was most likely a matter of unconscious design. This beautiful, haunting novel is an imagined account of the death of William Shakespeare's 11-year-old son, and even Ms. O'Farrell found it subject to challenge. One of the reasons I kept putting off writing the book was because I had a weird superstition about not writing it before my son was past the age of 11, she told People magazine. My own sons are long since grown, but it takes only the smallest imaginative leap for me to fall into similar atavistic thoughts. But the possibility of encountering a devastating plot point is not a reasonable measure by which to judge a work of art. Art is supposed to break our hearts. It's supposed to crack us open to every raw, elemental feeling a human heart can bear. That's how it makes us more human. It's also what makes the sometimes brutal world itself seem a little more bearable, if only in helping us to understand how far from alone we are. Surely this truth is as relevant in our own precarious era as it was during Shakespeare's. We turn to art in part to make sense of a life that is heartbreakingly fragile. At the end of a devastating year, when every value I hold close was under attack, the imagined death at the heart of a brilliant book no longer seemed to me like something to fear. So I finally read Hamnet. It was every bit as transcendent as Heywood told me it was. Not long after I finished reading, the film version came out. Heywood and I saw it with friends at the Belcourt, Nashville's historic art house theater. We all left stunned by the film's beauty and its power, by its unleashed intensity. We talked about it on the walk to dinner. We talked about it during dinner, and again at our house afterward. For the better part of a month, I could not stop thinking about Hamnet. I kept returning to the book, rereading parts of it. I went back to the Belcourt and saw the film again, this time alone, registering details I'd missed on the first viewing. The more time I spent with Hamnet, both novel and film, the more it seemed like every glorious thing that art can be. We don't know how the historical Hamlet died. We don't know whether Shakespeare wrote his great tragedy Hamlet in response to the loss of his son, as Hamnet posits. What we do know is that in Elizabethan England, where spelling had not yet been standardized, Hamnet and Hamlet were different spellings of the same name. And though Hamnet leads to and falls from the death of the title character, it is primarily the story of Hamlet's mother, about whom next to nothing exists in the historical record. In Ms. O'Farrell's account, Agnes, the daughter of a forest witch, inherits her mother's gift for healing and piercing insight. She grows up feeling too dark, too tall, too unruly, too opinionated. She is as out of place in the provincial world of Stratford-upon-Avon as her brilliant husband is. The Latin tutor, as Shakespeare is called in the novel, loves her because she sees the world as no one else does. She loves him back because she sees in him a landscape of spaces and vacancies, dense patches, underground caves, rises and descents. She recognizes this internal landscape as bigger than both of them. Hamnet, then, is not only an exploration of the relationship between grief and dramatic art, but it also proposes an answer to the question that continues to vex a small subset of Shakespeareans. Could a Glover's son from a muddy backwater of Tudor England really write some of the greatest works of literary art the English language has ever produced? Of course, he could. In the imagined world of Hamlet, this extraordinary transformation happens the same way it happens in Shakespeare's tragedies, through a combination of character and circumstance. Shakespeare is a writer because he was born a writer. In Hamlet, he escapes the limitations of Stratford because he married a woman who sees his truth and encourages his gift even as she protects her own. In other words, this is as much a book and a film about art as it is a tale of love and grief. It tells us something about how art is formed and informed, not only by life, but also by felt imagination. The tragedy of Hamlet is not a true account of the death of Shakespeare's young son, any more than Ms. O'Farrell's novel is. Art simply doesn't work that way. True art makes of life a kind of collage, a patchwork of real and unreal, of thought and memory and imagination. By the end of the story, we understand Ms. O'Farrell's Shakespeare to be a genius by what he makes of the raw material of unspeakable grief. It's fair to say the same for what Ms. O'Farrell has made of her own unspeakable fears. So many shards of the living world, small and large, go into making a work of art. So many shards of the living artist do so as well. Genius is a lightning bolt. Very few of the slings and arrows that we will inevitably suffer could ever be fashioned into anything as enduring as Hamlet, but they can make us cling to the beauty of the world, newly reminded of how fleeting it all is, how fleeting we all are. I spent the end of 2025 immersed in the hushed language and visual palette of Hamlet, just as online algorithms, anticipating the season of fruitless goals, fed me promises of transformative weight loss plans and exercise routines and methods for achieving a life that is calmer, happier, better organized, fill in the blank here. The repeated collision between commercial manipulation and high art became almost comical. We're here such a short while, I kept thinking. Aren't most of us basically okay as we are? Will it matter in 400 years if we're a little overweight, a bit out of shape, somewhat disorganized, definitely too distracted? Sure, it's facile and shallow to draw any simplistic moral from a story as magnificent as Hamlet, never mind a moral related to the futility of New Year's resolutions. Nevertheless, wouldn't it make more sense to skip the self-improvement resolutions this year and look instead for great works of art to surrender to let our hearts keep breaking as the fleeting world makes us just a little more human, because the rest, as Shakespeare knew, is silence. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the Monday, January 5th New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio reading service. This is Ted. Again, I hope you enjoyed this, and I will talk to you next week. Bye.